I'm glad Star Trek Picard abandoned this awful 7 of 9 Borg Queen storyline. Star Trek Picard took bold creative risks when it reintroduced the beloved Jean-Luc Picard to the small screen, but it didn't shy away from exploring some darker aspects of Star Trek lore, including the complex legacy of the Borg. One of the most debated narrative arcs, however, is how the series seemed to have set up a connection between 7 of 9 and the Borg Queen, an idea that, in hindsight, I'm incredibly glad the show ultimately abandoned. In this essay, we'll look at why this storyline could have been a disastrous misstep for 7 of 9's character, and why Picard was better off not fully pursuing it. 7 of 9's legacy, a survivor, not a queen. When 7 of 9 first appeared in Star Trek Voyager, she was an instant fan favorite. The character, originally Annika Hansen, was assimilated into the Borg at the age of 6, and by the time we met her as 7, she had spent years under the Borg Collective's control. Her emotional and intellectual journey throughout Voyager was profound, as she slowly regained her humanity and learned to understand and control her emotions. This was a central part of 7's arc, her survival and rehabilitation after her liberation from the Borg. Unlike other ex-Borg characters like Hugh or Lore, 7's story wasn't about regaining her freedom from the Borg in a moment of rebellion. It was about rediscovering herself after decades of being controlled by the Collective. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a symbol of resilience, the journey from being a mindless drone to a self-aware individual. So when Picard introduced the notion of 7 becoming involved with the Borg Queen storyline again, it was a dangerous proposition. The Borg Queen has traditionally been a representation of the Borg Collective itself, a force of cold, unfeeling control. To place 7 in a direct relationship with the Queen would have undermined the very thing that made her arc so powerful, her independence from the Borg. Imagine the dissonance between the 7 we knew and loved from Voyager, a woman who had finally embraced her humanity, and the concept of her returning to the Borg Queen's influence. It would have diminished everything that 7 had achieved over the course of Voyager. She had escaped the Borg. She was not the Borg Queen's heir or successor. To make her a part of the Borg Queen's legacy would have undermined the growth 7 had made and set her back into the same cycle of trauma and manipulation that defined her early years. The Borg Queen as a symbol of control. The Borg Queen has always been a problematic character for some fans, mostly because she presents a unique, almost paradoxical role within the Borg Collective. On one hand, she is a singular figure, appearing in Star Trek, First Contact, Voyager, and later Star Trek Picard, who seems to represent the individuality of the Collective, yet she is also a tool of control over the other drones. Her existence is an inherent contradiction. She is both a part of the Borg and its controller. The Borg Queen isn't just a leader. She is the embodiment of the Borg's cold logic, devoid of empathy or individuality. She is the perfect antithesis of 7 of 9, who spent years breaking free from that very cold logic and trying to reconnect with the human side of her that was suppressed during her years of assimilation. Making 7 of 9 the Borg Queen, or even more deeply tied to the Queen's influence, would have done a disservice to everything 7 stood for. One of the most interesting aspects of the Borg Queen is her control over the Collective, which is predicated on manipulation and an imposed hierarchy. 7's defiance of that hierarchy was her strength. She fought back against being the collective mind of the Borg. She resisted the cold, emotionless logic that defined the Collective. To turn 7 into a Borg Queen would have been a betrayal of her character's fundamental nature. The trap of nostalgia. Picard's tempting but risky Borg arc. Star Trek Picard was, for many fans, a return to the past, a chance to see beloved characters in new, often surprising contexts. The allure of bringing an established lore like the Borg was inevitable. But Picard's Borg-related plotlines were extremely risky, particularly in how it dealt with 7's legacy. In the earlier seasons of Picard, the show explored Picard's own trauma from the Borg, which was fascinating and handled with complexity. However, that same trauma resurfaced for other characters, especially 7, in ways that felt potentially reductive. Initially, Picard seemed poised to tie 7's fate more closely with the Borg, especially as she became involved with the show's main narrative, which included a return to the Borg as an antagonist. The introduction of the Borg as a significant threat to Picard's journey was fine, but the idea that Seven might end up in a Borg Queen role felt dangerously close to pandering to nostalgia. This was a show about returning to the classics, yet the choices that could have been made here were largely rooted in the fear of what the fans expected, not in what was best for the character's growth. For all its attempts to balance new ideas with nostalgic beats, Picard frequently fell into the trap of referencing older Star Trek material without fully justifying those decisions. The Borg Queen storyline would have been an example of this, an unnecessary throwback that would have tied Seven too closely to a legacy she had already escaped from. It wasn't enough to say, Seven's past is the Borg, her growth was the story. The better alternative, Seven as a captain and human in her own right. What Picard did do, however, was give Seven a chance to stand on her own as a leader and a complex individual, something Voyager only hinted at in the series finale. In Picard, we see Seven as a fierce, resourceful individual who is not defined by her Borg past, but is instead propelled forward by her desire for justice and survival. By the time Seven joins the crew of Picard, she is a fully realized character, one who has rejected the control of the Borg, but also one who understands the complexities of trauma and healing. Rather than placing her into a storyline where she might once again be in a subservient or secondary position to the Borg Queen, Picard allows Seven to chart her own course. She becomes a leader in her own right, not the inheritor of some dark legacy. In doing so, the show allowed Seven to have her own agency and destiny, not as a queen, not as a victim, but as a hero. Her arc in Picard worked because it respected the emotional weight of her trauma and gave her the agency to move beyond it. This wasn't about avoiding the Borg as a concept, but instead about Seven owning her future without being defined by her past. Seven, in this series, is not a pawn in a larger galactic scheme. She's a fully realized character who deals with her past on her own terms, choosing to be her own person, regardless of what the Borg might want. Conclusion, a misstep that was avoided. In the end, Picard's decision to avoid a full-fledged 7 of 9 Borg Queen storyline was a wise one. By choosing to focus on her growth as a person outside of her Borg past, the series preserved the integrity of Seven's arc from Voyager and gave her the respect she deserved as a complex, multifaceted character. 7 of 9 was never going to be a Borg Queen, she was always meant to be something far more important. A survivor, a leader, and a human being. This decision, rather than being a missed opportunity, turned out to be the perfect way to handle Seven's journey post-Voyager. The Borg Queen might always be a part of the Star Trek universe, but 7 of 9's story will always be about overcoming her past, not becoming trapped by it. For that, we should all be grateful. Complex, multifaceted character. 7 of 9 was never going to be a Borg Queen, she was always meant to be something far more important, a survivor, a leader, and a human being. This decision, rather than being a missed opportunity, turned out to be the perfect way to handle Seven's journey post-Voyager. The Borg Queen might always be a part of the Star Trek universe, but 7 of